Welcome to Past Times at Jerusalem High, an expository study of the book of Ezekiel to help us better understand the times of Ezekiel in redemptive history and how it applies to our lives today. Welcome. Once again, we're picking up here in the explanation here of this parable being detailed here in chapter 17 of Ezekiel. God had given Ezekiel this parable to explain how God was going to deal with the city of Jerusalem. And once again, he refers to these two eagles dealing with this tree at Jerusalem, and then that tree becoming a vine. Let's explain that a little more clearly. As we left off in our last session, we talked about how a tree, it's normative for that to be the illustration of a family lineage and genealogy, family history, our family tree. Once again, we start at the top with our great-great-great-grandparents at the top of that tree, and then we see succeeding generations illustrated by branches. We then go to great-grandparents and grandparents, and then our parents and their siblings, and of course then their children. And as each generation goes by, we see the family spread out with branches and bearing fruit, so to speak, children and progeny, going back all the way back to great-great-great-grandparents. So it's not unusual, and once again, this is an earthly illustration for us to understand a biblical truth about God and who He is and how He deals with us as people. It is a parable. So the parable here, the parallel here is this tree that we're hearing about here in Ezekiel 17 is referring to the family tree of King David, how King David had been the king and ruler over Jerusalem. And it's once again, I think you can look at that from a couple of points. People have argued and said the reason why it's a cedar tree is because cedar trees are very strong, powerful trees. David is obviously one of Israel's great, strong, powerful leaders. It's a very deep-rooted tree that is strong and stands firm. So I think that's a perfect illustration. We also see, though, too, there was an illustration with David and his relationship with Lebanon and with King Hiram, and how when he was building the temple, he used what? The cedars of Lebanon. So there's another parallel there. There's another illustration there. Once again, we can see the significance of God using, having David use cedar wood to build the temple. Once again, was to demonstrate God's power and glory and might, and for His temple to be an everlasting one. It was symbolic of that. So there are a couple, I think, cross references here or parallels here to this idea of a cedar tree, but it's clearly pointing back to David and David's lineage. And once again, this is why we did have to do a little bit of Old Testament history and extra-biblical history to understand who Nebuchadnezzar was and how he dealt with the city of Jerusalem. We know from not just biblical history, but extra-biblical history, this is, once again, history is history. The facts are the facts. The events are the events. And the Bible records those events, and extra-biblical history, archaeology, and other historical records back this up, that Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to the city of Jerusalem, not once, not twice, but 3 times. We see that him taking over Jerusalem in 609 BC, 597 BC, and then finally destroying Jerusalem in 586 BC. And in each of these times when he attacked Jerusalem, he was dealing with the government and the rulers of Jerusalem. Now, when he first attacks Jerusalem and overtakes it back around 609 BC, it's because he defeated Pharaoh, I make sure I have to pronounce his name right, Pharaoh Necho, who was the Pharaoh of Egypt. He defeated Egypt at the Battle of Carchemish in 609. And in 609, Jerusalem was sort of like under the power and under the influence and under the reign of Pharaoh in Egypt. So when Nebuchadnezzar comes on and he defeats Pharaoh and defeats Egypt, he now takes over Jerusalem. And when he does here, the reigning king, the reigning descendant of Jerusalem at that time, who was the descendant of David, was Jehoiachin. And so when he comes here and conquers Jerusalem or overtakes Jerusalem in 609 BC, he removes Jehoiachin as the ruler of Jerusalem, and he sets in place instead Zedekiah. And we see that when he does establish the city here, and he overtakes it, and he removes Jehoiachin, he also removes the household of David, and also the other family and friends of the descendants of David, the ruling household, the government, the leadership of Jerusalem, which included even the likes of Daniel and his friends. So they were all led out of exile. This is really the first exile that's brought out of Jerusalem at that time, and in all likelihood also included Ezekiel. These leaders of Jerusalem were removed. And once again, this is Nebuchadnezzar being a very wise conqueror. I'm going to put my own people in power and place over here in Jerusalem. I'm going to remove Jerusalem's ability to govern itself, and I'm going to put in government leaders who are going to be subject to me. But this is all illustrated here in these succeeding verses. He cropped off the topmost young twig, referring to Jehoiachin, and carried into the land of trade. Land of trade is referring to Babylon. Even before Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon, the Chaldeans, were known for their mercantile industry. They were known for being a people of trade and going out and trading with other people, using their goods to support themselves economically. This goes back to Abraham. This shows us, to some extent, gives us some clarity and insight as to the faith of Abraham. Because Abraham left Babylon. He left Chaldea. He left the city of Ur, this mercantile culture and society, and he became agrarian. He became a shepherd living out in the wilderness. He left the lap of luxury, living in this urban economic environment, powerful economic environment, left that all behind, this great material world. He left that all behind and decided to live an agrarian lifestyle, live out in the wilderness and live off the land. Now, this would be like if Abraham was living today. He leaves New York City, this big financial, economic center and center of trade in the world. He leaves that and moves out to Kansas and starts a farm. That's what Abraham did. So Abraham left his lifestyle and trusted in the Word of God. That's why he's considered a man of faith, and his faith was accounted to him, obviously, as righteousness, and also trusting in God and the promises to bring about salvation through his seed in the person of his son, Jesus Christ. So Abraham had this faith, but his faith, he put his money where his mouth was. He left everything behind. God told him, leave this all behind and follow after me. Just as Christ says to us, be willing to leave everything behind and follow after me. Give up this world and follow after me and trust me. Trust me to be your God and for you to be my people, for you to be provided for and blessed. We are to trust God and his salvation, his sovereignty, his strength, his means, who he is. We live and breathe and exist because of who God is. And we always have to see our lives as one that is totally dependent upon God. And as we saw here with Jerusalem throughout its history, and even now in the days of Ezekiel, Israel was trying to make itself God and live for itself and not trust and rely on God. They're brought to this land of trade, referring to Babylon, the city of merchants, this mercantile culture, material culture. And he took some of the seed of the land and planted it in a fertile land. And he placed it by abundant waters and set it like a willow tree. In other words, what he's saying is he made Jerusalem under the subject control and rule of Babylon. And he removed all its leadership. And then instead he sends Zedekiah over the city to rule and reign over Jerusalem. And so when God is working through through Nebuchadnezzar to deal with the people of Jerusalem, that's what's evident here. But then we see as time goes on here that another eagle comes onto the scene. Now this is referring once again, Egypt, even though Babylon had defeated Egypt, it doesn't mean Egypt stopped being a world power or not ceased being a competitor or a rival of Nebuchadnezzar. Because then Zedekiah starts to get all into himself and starts thinking he doesn't have to listen to Nebuchadnezzar. Jehoiachin made that mistake. He said, I don't have to listen to Nebuchadnezzar. I can reign and rule. And Nebuchadnezzar said no. And so once again, Nebuchadnezzar comes in and actually destroys the city of Jerusalem. Not destroys it, but he lays siege to it and attacks it and overtakes it in 597 BC. And he removes Jehoiachin as the king, and he sets up Zedekiah. And what Ezekiel is talking about here, where he's writing now, is between this time when Jehoiachin had been removed as king, and now Zedekiah has been set as king over Jerusalem under Nebuchadnezzar's reign and rule. And he's pointing out that now even Zedekiah is now going to try and seek to rebel against Nebuchadnezzar. And he's going to look to this other great eagle. He's going to look to the eagle of Egypt. And he thinks he can cut a deal with Egypt and get a better deal from Egypt. And he's going to oppose Nebuchadnezzar. And of course, this is all leading up to God is now going to bring judgment upon Jerusalem again through the means of Nebuchadnezzar. And of course, this all leads to Nebuchadnezzar's siege and destruction of Jerusalem in 586 now BC, 586 BC. And this is what Ezekiel has been warning about in all these previous chapters, that there's coming this final judgment upon Jerusalem for its rebellion against God. And that God is going, in that Nebuchadnezzar is God's means of bringing this judgment. And this is why, God is saying through the prophet Ezekiel, here they are, they're rebelling against me again under Zedekiah's rule. And do they think they're going to thrive? Do they think they're going to survive this? Have they not learned their lessons? No, they're going to fall. If they're not going to worship and trust me and obey me, I'm bringing this judgment. Jerusalem will not thrive. There are a couple of lessons that we need to glean from this parable, but I first needed to lay out sort of the historical background and what these parables are. This parable is referring to is clearly referring to how Nebuchadnezzar was dealing with the city of Jerusalem. But as we read on here, we start to realize this isn't just about the politics of the day. This wasn't just about the international affairs of Egypt, Jerusalem, and Nebuchadnezzar. What is really at the heart of all this, now once again, I made a distinction before between biblical history and extra-biblical history. Biblical history and extra-biblical history will both point to these events. They'll teach us about Egypt and Israel and Babylon and say, here's what's happened. Here's what happened in 609 BC. Here's what happened in 597 BC. Here's what happened in 586 BC. But biblical history and biblical truth gives us more of the reason why all these events took place, and points to us to God and how God is sovereign over all these things, and how God is sovereignly dealing with Jerusalem, his covenant people, the people he had called out and made his own, the people he had blessed, and the people then who had rebelled against him and turned away from him and hardened their hearts against him, and now started to put idols in the temple, the very presence of where God dwells in the temple. And now God is now going to destroy the city of Jerusalem. Once again, we see God, quote unquote, repeating himself. But as we've noticed through this study in Ezekiel, every time God repeats himself, he has a reason for it. The first reason being is we need God to repeat himself to us. We need to be constantly reminded who God is and who we are, and how totally dependent we are on God, and how he is our creator, and how salvation can only be found through him and his son, Jesus Christ, and how we need to turn away from our sin, and how we need to put our full, complete faith in God through his son, Jesus Christ, and we need to worship him and him alone. Because of our fallen state, we need to hear continually from God who he is. That's why we said last week, a couple of sessions ago, when we were talking about parables, one of the reasons that God teaches us in parables is so that we'll get it. Because what? We're not only finite creatures who don't know everything, we're fallen finite creatures. We're creatures who forget, because of our sin, we forget about who God is, and we fall prey to our sin rather than trusting in the Word of God. So thank God that he repeats himself to us. But he's also repeating this judgment upon Jerusalem so that we see this is how corrupt Israel was. It wasn't just corrupt in its idolatry, it was corrupt in its dealings with other men. And that's what I want to explore a little bit more now in the next session as we dig into this parable a little bit more, and what we read here in the ensuing verses of where God is explaining the parable and making it clear that this isn't, once again, just about Nebuchadnezzar and Jerusalem. This is really about Israel and how it related to God, and how it not only violated its covenant and its agreements with Nebuchadnezzar, it's ultimately violating its covenant with God himself. And we'll look at that in more detail in the next session.